Hi, this is Kristina McMorris, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kristina McMorris.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, click on the subscribe buttons in the right-hand sidebar. There's places where you can subscribe in iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher Radio and even YouTube, hankgarner.com. I'd like to thank some sponsors that make this show possible. Grammarly. Go to getgrammarly.com/Hank to sign up for your free account. Grammarly, built by linguists and language lovers, Grammarly's writing app finds and corrects hundreds of complex writing errors, so you don't have to. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. Go to getgrammarly.com/Hank when you're working on that new book before you send it to your final editor. Let Grammarly take a pass at it. You'd be surprised at what it'll catch, and your editor will thank you for it. Brand new from Stefan Bolt's The White Dragon Omnibus Edition. This book has been 2 years in the making for those of us that have been following along as Stefan has released the books Genesis, Crucible, and Alchemy. We have been on the edge of our seats waiting to see how he would finish the series, and now you can read it all in one volume. No waiting. Genesis, Crucible, and Alchemy, The White Dragon series by Stefan Boltz. Available now. There's links to it in the show notes. Untold Deception by William Stakos. I looked up. The executioner pulled the lever. Her body fell, and the crowd cheered. I couldn't watch the rest, so I lowered my eyes to the ground. I think I understand now. I get it, Mom. I now know what it means to grow up. Untold Deception by William Stakos is a book full of magic, coming-of-age story, and a story about family. Check out the link in the show notes, Untold Deception by William Stakos. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip for Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have my new friend, Kristina McMorris, on the show with us today. She has a phenomenal new book called Sold on a Monday that is destined to be probably one of my favorite books of the year. And you guys are really going to want to get a copy of this book after hearing today's show. I just know it. Welcome to the show, Kristina.
Hi, thank you. What a welcome. My God. I'd like to be on your show anytime with every book, clearly.
Oh, well, you have an open invitation anytime you want to do that. But Kristina, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, goodness, that is a really good question. You know, what's funny is I had no plans of being a creative writer. Actually, I'm one of those weird accidental authors who's always loved the art of storytelling, but just not necessarily in the written form for myself. Instead, I loved movies, and I've always been a big movie buff, and so I tend to write my stories as if I'm seeing a movie in my head, and I write it down now. But to answer your question, the first memory I had really of becoming a writer like I am now is just a handful of years ago. I was visiting my grandmother up on the Hood Canal in Washington, and I sat down for an afternoon with her and interviewed her about her life because I wanted to put together a really fun biography to put in a self-published cookbook of all of her favorite recipes she had collected and created over decades to give to the grandkids as a Christmas gift, as a lot of families do, of course.
Yeah.
And that was going to be it. And when she shared all these amazing stories with me of, you know, I joke about walking 8 miles to school uphill both ways in a snowstorm, and then she shared that she and my late grandfather had only dated twice during World War II. he came home on leave. They got married during World War II and were married for 50 years until he passed away, as they had fallen in love completely through the letters. I thought, wow, that would make an amazing movie. But of course, as time went on, I thought, I think I would actually love to write this down as a novel. And so that is my first memory, is actually being with my grandmother and thinking I think I can write this as a book. But my only intention truly was to give the copy to my kids and have them read a story their mom wrote, and hopefully it was good enough to pass along to their kids. And then I thought, maybe I'll try this, with publishing, and of course it wasn't that easy. I'm not being that ridiculous, so people don't hate me quite yet. I really learned how much I didn't know, and did a lot of catching up and a lot of work on my craft and networking and understanding the art of storytelling on the page.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a real gift. The naivete, the innocence, if you will, of that first desire to write and publish. And, it's a real gift to not have gone through rejection yet, and to not know what you don't know yet. Because that's where a lot of those dreams and desires are born. And when you don't have that negative feedback yet, I think you really do start to believe that the gift that you have, can really be something.
Absolutely. I so agree with you. And I credit a lot of my success in my blissful ignorance in the beginning, because as I tell a lot of people, in any, I think, achievement that you feel really good about, that you've worked really hard toward, and especially in the arts, I think you have to have that. Otherwise, you would know better than to get yourself into that crazy business, and you would run screaming the other way. But once you're in too far to turn back, you think, all right, I've gone this far, I might as well keep going. And then it just, determination and kicks in, of course, and hopefully people just keep going. But I think that's why when you ask kids, I think of when you ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? They're so unlimited in what they think, and I think that it's a special gift, and like you mentioned, and something that you absolutely need to pursue something in the arts.
Right. I want to come back to Grandma Jean in a minute, and that fantastic story of hers that you uncovered and that eventually led to your writing career. But you mentioned earlier that you were a big fan of movies, and that your writing style is, to you, like interpreting a movie that you're seeing in your mind. I think a lot of people are kind of built the way that you're built, in that we all see stories differently, and we all pursue storytelling differently. And of course, we focus mainly on the written word on this podcast, but really, what I love is storytellers. There's a certain gift, I believe, that certain people have to just conjure up stories out of nothing. And sometimes they become books, and sometimes they become movies, and sometimes they become plays, and sometimes they're just told on the back porch and to make family members laugh and things like that. But what kinds of stories really excited you when you were young?
When I was young, goodness, I think I always loved the stories that, of course, are so popular now too. The stories that have a twist that maybe you don't see coming, the twists and turns of a roller coaster ride. So I think those are the stories that I like to tell. I hope, in that it comes across to readers. I hope, anyhow, and that it's sort of a roller coaster ride. I like the click, 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 click up to the top, and then it just starts going. And I like the really visual stories, of course, for the very reason I told you, and that I love the visual arts in that form. So I like the stories that really connect people, and they're things that we can relate to, and also bring back the past. It makes us feel like we have stepped back in time, which are some of my absolute favorite books to read, is historical fiction, and that is exactly why I decided to write it. I was told at one point, which is very wise, is write the book that you would want to read, and for some reason that the historical fiction is just something that is so special to me, and that I feel like more than any other book, I feel like I have stepped into another world. Yeah.
That series of stories that you started uncovering from your grandmother and the letters, and that great story of her and your grandfather, and really falling in love through letters. When you started realizing that this was bigger than you ever imagined. And you planned to put these in a cookbook. Did that plan change? Did you publish that cookbook? What did you finally do with your grandmother's stories?
Yeah, well, it was all recipes, and like I said, her biography in the beginning of the book, and we really did just keep it as, well, first, we kept it as a family Christmas gift, and then when I started sharing it with friends, they said, I'd want a copy, and the story just seemed so fun to share with people that I ended up making a lot more copies than we had planned on, and a printer was amazing, and that they stepped up and printed it at cost for us so that we could help raise money for the food bank, which is my grandmother's favorite volunteer activity of the week. And it just seemed right that money from a cookbook that kind of fills, the tummies, the stomachs, and the hearts of people would also help literally fill their stomachs. And so that's how it started, and we ended up selling it in some bookstores, independent stores, and then Borders at the time also picked it up, which was really exciting. So the next thing you knew, poor Grandma Jean, who she did not sign on for this, I will tell you. She came to visit, and I said, Grandma, happy early, Christmas present. By the way, tomorrow morning we are going to be on 3 different talk shows and a morning show and a news program, and you're being interviewed. And she just looked at me like, it's a good thing she had a good heart. Let me tell you that it beat okay at that point, because I think we might have lost Grandma that day.
Oh my goodness, that is so funny. The reluctant star of the story.
It was. What a great memory we had together, though. And she's still alive and still a Spitfire, and is in her mid-90s, and she's just amazing. I'm just in awe of her. So when I asked her, Grandma, how do you feel about this book now? My book, Letters from Home, my debut that was inspired by her, said, how do you feel about this book being out there? And her answer, of course, from a woman who has lived through the Great Depression and World Wars and had, incredible hardships through her life and survived with such grace, her answer was, well, I think it's very lovely, dear. So, in other words, there's not much that rattles this woman one way or the other.
So that's nice. And would you like a piece of pie now?
Yes, exactly. Honey, please go downstairs and bring me up the crescent rolls.
Right.
How it works.
That's exactly how my grandmother would have been. Oh, that's lovely. Now let's get on to something important.
Right. Exactly.
So let's talk about that cookbook and then Letters from Home. Obviously you had been bitten by the bug through this process. When did you know that there was another story to tell, or maybe a deeper story to tell, that you wanted to go from this cookbook that you did to this other story? How did that progression happen?
Yeah, so what happened was I thought of her story. Of course, I wasn't going to presume to write their story, but I imagined this image in my head of a film type story of a Cyrano de Bergerac set during World War II, because talking to my grandmother, one comment she made was, it all sounds very romantic and wonderful, and which it was, of course, at the time, exchanging these beautiful letters back and forth and getting to know someone through their writing, and they got married because of them. But at the end, she said, she did mention the reality of it. She said, however, when he came home and we got married, and we were married already at that point. She said, but he came home to stay after the war. She said, you suddenly realize, wow, how much do I really know this person? Someone that they had spent very limited time in person with. And so she said, we really then had to truly get to know each other, and we realized that we had been infatuated. We were not in love yet, and we grew to be in love by all of the misunderstandings and the communications and the hardships we went through, and truly learning who the other person was is when real love grew. And I love that, and it still gives me chills. And
Oh, absolutely.
The best advice and thoughts ever. So when I took that story from her, I walked away thinking, how well do you truly know someone through letters alone? And what if there was a person on the other side that wasn't being entirely truthful about who they were, and how would that affect the relationship once you did meet in person? So that's where the story came from.
Gotcha. And this is a novel inspired by your grandmother's stories, but you took this to the next step and created characters in a situation that was entirely new, right?
That is absolutely right. Yes. So they are all fictional characters, but of course, as any just about any author I know, works in the works pieces of who they know and people that have touched them, and even parts of themselves into the story. So many great little anecdotes that my grandparents shared with me, and got worked into the story. I remember my grandfather; he passed away 20-some years ago, and he and I were very close. And he was the dark Irishman, the funniest sense of humor you've ever heard, and he had this female sailor girl on his forearm, it was a pretty large tattoo he got when he was 17, had a few drinks with his sailor buddies and woke up with a very large tattoo, and thankfully she had clothes on because there was no lasering it off at that point. And she looked like the Cracker Jack girl with her hands on her hips, and when I knew him, he called her Grandma. And I would call and say, "Hey, Papa, how is Grandma doing?" And the thing is, what he could do with that tattoo is he would move his knuckles and he would make her dance. And he'd say, "Well, her body's drooping, but she can still dance." And so I remember thinking that was the epitome of my grandfather. And you cannot make that stuff up, and it has to go in the book.
So funny, so funny. So you get the story out, you get it written. The cookbook was a self-published endeavor, and it sounds like that you really had a lot of success with it, probably regionally. How did you get this book noticed and kind of expand your platform?
As far as the cookbook or Letters from Home?
Yeah, Letters from Home.
Sure, absolutely. So with Letters from Home, what happened was, with that book, I had sent it out to agents and got a lot of form rejections.
Yeah.
There's a lot of "Dear Author," without my name, and the joke I have, of course, is that you're doing better when the rejection letters come in with your name on them, typed on the letter, and they actually talk about your book in the title that they're rejecting. Then the compliments get heavier than the reasons that they're rejecting it, and I just kept learning and redrafting and writing and learning and reading, and eventually, it starts getting better and more positive. One of the reasons I remember I kept seeing that, you'll laugh at now, of course, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will, one of the most common reasons I got rejected in my letters toward the end, before it sold, was I was told numerous times that there was no market for World War II.
What?
So unless...
talk about short-sighted.
A jaw drop on that one when we laugh at today's market.
Oh, my goodness.
You can't push out the World War II books fast enough for people at this point.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
At the time, it was all military thrillers, and nonfiction really was World War II, is what people were reading.
What the heck? That is insane.
Isn't that insane? And I'm so glad I didn't know that. Like we were talking about earlier, the blissful ignorance. If I had known that, I probably would have said, "Oh, that's fine, write it for my kids, don't even pursue it." And instead, I thought, you know what? Somebody should have told me that 80,000 words ago, so I'm just going to go ahead and try because it's done already.
Right.
And thank goodness, because I ended up, finding an agent who was very excited and passionate about it, and it didn't matter what the market was saying. And then it sold right away, which was a very happy ending to that. But my publisher at the time even held off right when they bought it. They said they were holding off for 2 years to put it out, and I really think they were holding off for the wave of books that were kind of on their way, which was very wise. Yeah.
Or you were a trendsetter. So yeah,
right.
I'm with you. I'll posit that you were the trendsetter that kicked it all off.
Thank you. I agree with you.
Yeah.
My children agree with you, so
That's right. Why not? It's our story to tell, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So after Letters from Home, you have published several other books, 3 or 4 other books. Well, more than that. How many books have you published between the first one? What is Sold on a Monday, your new novel? What number is that for you?
Yeah. So that is number 5 as far as novels go.
Okay,
it's my 5th novel and my 7th book, so it gets a little confusing.
Yes.
And that I had 2 anthologies in between. So I did write 2 novellas that went in collections to kind of intersperse through the years.
Yeah. So you've kind of carved out a niche for yourself in publishing. Things are going well, and then you stumble on a story that ignited this newest book. And Sold on a Monday is available everywhere now. There's a link to it in the show notes. But what was it that triggered the story for you? I think a lot of authors, story ideas are all around us. And sometimes the challenge is deciding which story idea you want to go with. Not that there's a shortage of story ideas, but then there are those ideas that when you come across a newspaper clipping or something that you just know, okay, this is a special story idea. What was the one for Sold on a Monday?
Yeah, for Sold on a Monday, what was unique about that story was it wasn't something that I necessarily read or heard from a family friend or passed along some kind of nugget of history that inspired all my other books, and that I'd come across this nugget of history that I think, how did people not know this? I should have known this before. Just when you think you know everything about World War II or 1930s or Great Depression, and you think, oh my gosh, this is an amazing story to tell. How come nobody's told this that I know of? And so in this case, what happened was this is the worst clickbait ever for a historical fiction author, of course, is that you get a headline that says 50 of the most shocking historical photos you've never seen, and you think, oh my goodness, out of 50 there's got to be one good story idea in there. And very often there are a lot of the photos I've seen or the articles I've read or something that you think, wow, that's amazing, but I don't know that that's a whole novel that I should tell. And in this case, I came across a photo, as you know, that has 4 children that are huddled on a stoop in Chicago, and the mother is behind them with shielding her face from the camera, turned away, and there's a sign next to them that reads, "For children for sale, inquire within." And as a mom myself of 2 young boys, it just really struck me hard, and I thought, how do you not just give up your children when you think it's for the betterment of their lives, that you hope that they're giving them a better life, but instead ask for money in return? And there are a lot of terrible reasons that come to mind, and then there are also, after that, as I thought more, very compassionate reasons, and that we really don't know the true story behind that picture like that unless you've walked in their shoes. And how do you judge someone like that? And I think we are so quick to judge, as society is right now, and that we're so used to soundbite news and snippets and headlines and a photo that we think we know everything that's happened there, and people draw assumptions very, very quickly today and judgments on those people. And that isn't always necessarily the right understanding, and it can sometimes really cause hardships for people because of those assumptions. And so that's where it began. And I ended up sitting back and saving that photo because it bothered me so much, and just kind of gripped hold of me and haunted me for months until I finally decided to write a novel.
It's just so shocking. It goes against everything that we, as a society, have come to expect about motherhood and about child rearing and just the general state of safety, maybe. We just assume a certain level of comfort and a certain level of community that would never allow something like that to happen, even though we know horrible things slip through the cracks all the time. People slip through the cracks because of horrible situations all the time. But we just kind of choose not to look at it. But then we see a photo like this that is just so shocking. What was that immediate reaction when you start forming the scenario of what could have caused this? What sorts of things went through your mind?
Well, I remember I was at a breakfast with a group of writers in Portland, here where I live, and it was still haunting me, and I hadn't written a word, and I told them, I think this is maybe my next story, but I just wasn't sure because I didn't want it to be so dark and depressing. It's not something I would have wanted to read, and my first thought was to write it from the kids' point of view, that they were sold and then they were separated and try to find each other, and it felt too much to me like Kristina Baker-Klein, who was a friend of mine who wrote the fantastic book Orphan Train. I felt like it would be Orphan Train 2, and I thought if I were going to write something like this, I would want to bring something new to the table because she'd already done it so well already. And what happened was I brought up the idea to my writer friends and said, I'm really, I'm hooked on this story idea, but I'm not quite sure about it, and I just can't figure out why a mother would do this. And one of my writer friends very, simply and smartly said, well, Kristina, because they wanted to eat. And I thought, wow, that shut me down very quickly. And I thought, you're right, that we are judging that picture on today's standards and how we would view the right or wrong of that, and not knowing really what people fully went through as a country back then. So I ended up doing more research about the photo. And what shocked me was I came across a follow-up article about the kids in the photo who had all grown to adults, and about half of them had passed away already, sadly. And the Northwest Indiana Times, and then it reran in the New York Post, interviewed them, and there was one line in the article that said, some family members claim the photo was staged. And when I looked back at the photo and saw the sign that was so perfectly painted, I thought, okay, that's kind of an interesting angle, that something I never wouldn't have occurred to me when we see that photo. And so I ended up reading more about the kids and found out that whether or not it was staged, a year after that photo was taken, there were all five of the children. She was pregnant in the photo, so all five of the children were actually given away or taken away, perhaps by the state, they're not quite sure, or sold. And I've since befriended one of the gals in the photo who actually was sold for $2. She claims her mother sold her for bingo money to a farmer and his wife who wanted them for farm labor. And her little brother started crying and saying that he didn't want to be separated from his sister, so they said, fine, we'll take him too for free. And the two of them had a very hard life. So it is not, unfortunately, as compassionate of a story as we'd like to hear, but which is also another reason why I decided to write the story from the reporter's point of view. And my story is completely, just like my grandparents' story, is fictionalized in the novel. So these are made-up characters that was inspired by the photo. But largely, I also wanted to give these kids a better outcome, a more hopeful ending than they ended up with, that I felt they deserved.
Well, when we talked about that, people making assumptions and judgments on one snippet of information, and then you get other information that starts coming out, like, well, maybe this was staged. That brings out a lot of complexity, because I would imagine a lot of people would prefer that the story that the world sees is that it was staged. There's a lot of not only the assumptions we make, but then the assumptions and the ideas that the people involved want to put out there because they want to protect themselves, or they want maybe you know what I mean. Like there's all sorts of layers to a story that you can start peeling back, and especially when you're writing fiction, you can explore all of those avenues, and it really becomes a wealth of story idea, I guess.
Yes, absolutely, I agree with you. Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, that it is interesting today. It was something really interesting I've seen from some people who've been kind enough to talk about Sold on a Monday online and the reviews and whatnot, and some people commenting how heartbreaking the photo was, especially to find out that my book was inspired by a real photo, and saying that if this had been published today, I would have assumed that it wasn't real. And I thought, isn't that interesting how that's changed? And versus in the 1930s, your first assumption would be that it is true. And I think that's an interesting change in today. Then, of course, we have technology that helps us out a bit more too today, in that things can be manipulated more easily, and information is spread in such a different way.
What's really interesting to me, Kristina, is that photo and that situation is less than 100 years old, and like you said, that you befriended one of the people actually involved in it, meaning we are within a lifetime of that possibility being a reality. And when you're writing historical fiction, you get to transport us, the readers, to a place and a time that is so foreign to us, even though it's so near to us, that we can live out these almost fictional things because we just can't even wrap our brains around it. So, as a historical fiction writer, how do you immerse yourself in this time and this place that allows you to so beautifully transport us to something we can't even imagine?
Well, I think that there is a mix there because you've got the time period, of course, that the settings and the music and the fashion and the societal standards at the time were very different than today. And you're right, it is not that much time that has passed. And yet there are some things that are very much the same, and there are some things that are very, very different. And so some of the really interesting things to me are how many of the topics in my story that are still so universal and timeless and relevant today. So people, readers have been bringing up, all these topics of a terrible topic, but human trafficking, of course, is something that will come up with a book called Sold on a Monday. And then you've got, the family separations and immigrants that are in my story, and women, gender roles in society and also in the workplace. In my story, as you know, I have a male reporter who has to work as a society reporter, which he absolutely dreads and hates because it was a female role that got to write about fluff, quote unquote, and they called them sob sisters. And you were called Nellie, short for Nellie Bly, obviously a female reporter at the time, if you were a man in that kind of position. And you also had my female character Lily, who is a secretary to the editor-in-chief and wants so much to be a columnist on her own. And she is a very skilled writer and researcher, and yet she is lucky to have a job during that time. So it's fun to explore all of those things, and as far as immersing myself into the time period to hopefully draw people back, I do a lot of research. Of course, there's imagination involved, but there's photos and movies and documentaries and memoirs. Memoirs are fantastic for that kind of thing. Those little tidbits of the things that you won't find really anywhere else.
Yeah. Kristina, how long do you work on a story? And the setting and the kind of the threads of the story before you actually start writing it, or do you just kind of launch into the story and see where it goes?
It usually kind of sits and simmers in my mind for quite some time, especially as I'm researching, and that was even more true with my World War II stories. Excuse me, because I had stories in there that I wrote. For example, my second novel was Bridge of Scarlet Leaves, and I dealt with the Japanese-American internment experience in that there were 200 non-Japanese spouses who lived in the camps voluntarily. And again, that was a nugget of history that I felt like, how did we not hear about this before? And so researching those kind of topics and battles at the time for my other novels, to write a World War II novel and to have some accuracy to it, I think you really have to think about your story for a while and know what time period you're in and what location you're in. Otherwise, there is so much information out there and research to be done in a world war that you could be researching for 10 years before you feel like you probably have enough to write accurately a story. And so in my case, it really helps to research in the beginning to lower it down so that my research becomes very focused. Otherwise, I think I'd never get past chapter 2. And so I would end up, thinking about it, researching it for quite some time, writing a synopsis that is usually pretty lengthy because my past editor loved long synopses. So he would say, write long, as long as you want. It can be up to 80 pages if you want. I thought, oh my goodness, 80 pages is he had an author who wrote 80-page synopses for him, and I thought, my goodness, all she has to do is add in the dialogue.
Exactly.
And her book is done. So, which was kind of nice. It's pretty smart, actually. So I got used to writing pretty lengthy ones, and that way it would help me figure out what I needed to research along the way. And when I was done with that, it would be about a 30-page synopsis. And then I do my Post-it board, which is very, very high-tech, my little mini Post-its, which, I say that jokingly because it's so not detailed by any means. It's just this little mini Post-it, that one per chapter. And it just lets me know what's going to happen in that chapter, a few words here and there. That really helps remind me that chapter is necessary in the book, that if you took that out like a Jenga pile, if you pulled it out, that it wouldn't still stand without it. And so I try to make sure that it's all important. And when I finish all that, to finally answer your question, I think that's usually about 5 months, 4 months or so typically, and it also depends on my deadline. So some of this has to move a lot faster when I am under a tighter deadline, but then I usually end up writing the book in about 9 months. It's kind of like having a baby.
Yeah. Certain books tend to be more I don't want to use the word timely because that's not the right word, but I guess like if you're talking about political thrillers, those things have a certain shelf life, especially if you're really hitting on events that are kind of in the headlines today, or trying to predict where maybe the worldwide political landscape might be next year. But if you pick up some military or political thrillers from, let's say, the 1980s, they're pretty dated and they don't have the same resonance. But when you're dealing with historical fiction, even though you can, kind of draw, inferences between some things that are happening, like human trafficking, like you mentioned, and that although not necessarily drawn specifically in the book, we as readers draw those similarities because of things going on today. When you're writing historical fiction, is there ever a sense of urgency that this is a story for that needs to be out now, or do you feel that these kinds of stories are sort of timeless and that there's not the same urgency? And I don't know if that makes any sense at all. I can see it in my head, but
yeah, no, it makes sense to me for sure. And I think you're spot on, and that the historical fiction we have that little bit of cushion that can give us some reassurance that we feel a little, I think in general, little less of a need to hurry to get this story out. I'm sure that there's some writers that feel more of a need to do that, or publishers for sure, if the trend seems hot right now. And there are a lot of books that are in that same similar kind of topic that are selling like crazy. Then as far as even, selling to the publishing houses, so knowing they're coming out within a year and wanting to get yours out there then as quickly as possible because you're worried that they're covering the same topic that you are and how that might affect your book. So I think there's always that a little bit, but I definitely think you're right as far as when we are writing about historical fiction, we could even wait a year or two and put that same book out there, and it usually would have the same impact on readers. With mine, I will share that you bring up a really good point, that one of the reasons why that I was hesitant to write from the kid's point of view or write the book at all, really, until I found a new perspective and what the consequences could be of a photo like that on people, is that I was concerned, that I thought, wow, this photo really affected me. I'm sure clearly I'm not alone in clicking on that clickbait and seeing this photo that has made the rounds, and especially the last few years. But in 1948 is when the photo was first published, even though it looks like the Great Depression, which is why my story takes place then. It went essentially what we call viral today. So it did go in other newspapers in about 10 to 12 other states. It ran all over the place. And so it is a photo that is out there, not as much as maybe Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, but you think that that is something a lot of people are already familiar with. And one of the fears I had as a writer then is, do I write this story and then find out that somebody else has written it too and has, about to come out 2 months before mine? And so that was a fear of mine, and it worked out wonderfully, I think, in that I thought, then I really have to make it unique. And that way, even if it does come out, it's going to be a different perspective, and that really is what fiction's all about, right? Is that we're not reinventing the wheel here. We are giving a voice to something that is unique, that somebody else doesn't have our voice. And so that's why I thought, well, if the reporter takes a photo of these kids and yet he means well by it and yet has devastating consequences for everyone in the photo, I thought to me that was more of a unique story that I could get excited about.
I got the audiobook a couple of days ago when I knew that you and I were going to get to talk. I went to Audible, got the audiobook, and have been listening to it. And you absolutely drop us right into the middle of the story, and I can feel all of the grit and the everything about this time period. You just expertly just open a window, and I just fell right into the story. You mentioned earlier that you were hesitant to tell the story until you could find a way to maybe bring some hope to these characters, I think is maybe how you said it. I have a feeling, though, that at the end of this book, you are not going to just make everything resolve perfectly with a nice, pretty little bow on it. How do you tell these kinds of stories and fight the temptation to just make them everyone lives happily ever after? These kinds of stories that continue to resonate with us, because even though there may be hope and it may not be all bleak, there's still the reality of the world that we live in.
Yeah. So I think with each of my books, there's a little bit of difference in the endings, in that some are very tragic, but I always try to end it with a strong sense of hope, and that every character has grown and changed dramatically and hopefully for the better through all of the stories. So I do like to write the stories in the 40s and the 30s, and specifically because I feel like there's so many hardships at the time that people went through that we can relate to today, that hopefully in your people's own lives they can think, wow, I'm going through such a hard time now, and but these characters made it through, and as real people did during that time period, and I can too. And that's always that hope as a writer, that it really can mean something really powerful for people in that way. And I know that I look at books in that way and look for inspiration and am touched by those kind of stories. And so with this story, first of all, thank you for the compliment as far as you feeling like that you were there. That means a lot. And with each story, I think I make a decision. As the story's going along, I often don't know exactly how that book is going to end, have a sense of it, but sometimes that changes. And what I do tend to do is there are some of my stories that end a bit happier for the characters, but if I do that, it's because the characters have gone through so much hardship that I feel they earned it. I feel like they worked so hard for it, that to have a satisfying ending is so important to the characters and to me, and then hopefully to the readers too.
Right. Well, what a tremendous book that you put together, Kristina. This is a story I will not soon forget, and characters that will linger on, and that's what we as authors want, isn't it? We want our stories to continue to live on past what we thought about them, what we intended for these stories. We want these characters to take root in people, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think some of our favorite stories of all time, I like to think is, or any kind of art, is that we don't necessarily, after years and years pass, we don't necessarily remember all the details of something that we enjoyed so much or moved us, but we remember how we felt about it.
That's right.
So that's right. Pretty neat.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Sold on a Monday. It's available everywhere now. And Kristina, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show with me today. If people are just learning about you and your stories, where can they find you online to connect with you, dig through your back catalog, find out where you're on tour and all that good stuff?
Yeah, they can definitely go to my website. I'm on social media all over the place as well, and I love it when people connect with me there. But definitely go to my website. It's Kristina, with a K, McMorris.com. And like you said, I've got this insane 50-stop tour in 3 months, book tour coming up. I'm on event number 4 right now out of 50, so you're catching me at a really good time when I still know my name and the book that I'm talking about. So if they check on there, I'm hitting about 14 states, so there's a good chance that I'll probably be near you if you're listening to this. And I also have some really great features from my publisher that we worked together to put together some pretty neat things for book clubs, as far as recipes and theme playlists, and for a short time I'm also giving away these really fun party packs that have 1930s treats and wine glass charms to celebrate the end of Prohibition, and so I'm sending those out to book clubs within the U.S. as long as the supplies last. So I hope they check it out.
I love it so much. A 50-stop book tour is almost unheard of anymore. So you're telling me this now, right? Oh, I'm so happy for you. That is amazing. That's great.
Thank you.
Well, Kristina, we're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of Sold on a Monday. And thank you so much for talking with me today. I wish you huge success on the book.
Thank you so much. It was such a joy to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Knoll was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke. It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Knoll. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dillon!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond, and in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God, he served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.